"You don't belong at this table. This is a family dinner, and frankly, you're ruining the atmosphere." That's what my son-in-law said to me. In my own house, at my own dining room table. The one I'd built with my hands 32 years ago in the garage during a cold February weekend, because my wife wanted something solid, something that would last. He said it quietly, almost pleasantly, the way a man speaks when he's certain no one will challenge him. And the worst part? He was right. That night no one did. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the county of Maricopa, Arizona. I raised 2 kids in the house I bought in 1991, a 4-bedroom colonial on a half-acre lot in Chandler that I paid off in 2008. I coached Little League. I made my wife's coffee every morning. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, until she passed from ovarian cancer in 2019. After she was gone, I kept making that cup of coffee every morning for about 3 weeks before I realized what I was doing. Then I switched to black. I tell you all this because I want you to understand the kind of man I am. I am not the kind of man who makes scenes. I am not the kind of man who raises his voice at the dinner table. I was raised to believe that a man who loses his temper has already lost the argument. My father told me that when I was 12, and I believed him then, and I believe him now, which is why, when my son-in-law said those words to me at my own table, I set down my fork, wiped my mouth with a cloth napkin my daughter had bought at Home Goods, and which I privately found too thin to do the job, and I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. Let me back up. My daughter is 38. She married her husband 7 years ago at a vineyard outside Sedona, and I paid for most of the wedding. Not because I was asked to, but because her mother had always dreamed of seeing her married somewhere beautiful, and her mother wasn't here anymore to contribute. I didn't bring that up at the time. I didn't bring it up after. It was a gift, freely given, and I meant it that way. Her husband, I'll call him my son-in-law because that is what he is, legally, came into the picture about a year before the wedding. He's in pharmaceutical sales. He drives a lease car and wears cologne you can smell from 6 feet away, and has the particular kind of confidence that comes not from accomplishment but from the persistent belief that he is the most capable person in any room. He wasn't unkind to me at first. He was actually almost aggressively friendly, the handshake on the shoulder type, the guy who calls you sir, in a way that's almost too respectful to be genuine. I noticed it, but I didn't dwell on it. My daughter loved him. That was enough for me. They had a son. My grandson was born in 2020, right in the middle of everything that was happening in the world. And I drove 4 hours to the hospital and sat in a parking lot because they weren't allowing visitors. My daughter called me from the delivery room, and I listened to that baby cry for the first time over a cell phone in a parking structure in Phoenix, and I told her I was proud of her, and I meant every syllable. My grandson is 4 years old now, and he is the greatest thing that has happened to me since his grandmother was alive. He calls me Pop. He likes trucks and blueberries, and a particular song from a cartoon I can never remember the name of. When I pick him up from their house, he runs to the front door before I even ring the bell. About 2 years ago, my daughter came to me and said they were in some financial trouble. Her husband's income had been unpredictable. Commissions, she explained, the way you explain something you've been asked to explain and are tired of explaining. They were behind on their mortgage. I asked how far behind. She said 3 months. I asked how much. She said $6,200. I wrote a check that afternoon. I didn't think much of it. Parents help their children. That's the nature of the relationship. I was in a position to help, and I did. 6 months later, she came back. This time it was the car. His lease was up, and his credit had taken a hit, and they needed a bridge loan to get him into a new vehicle for work. Another $4,800. I gave it without a second thought. Then it was a medical bill. Then it was a home repair that the insurance wouldn't cover. Then it was a business opportunity he couldn't let pass. Something about investing in a friend's food truck operation that was going to be huge. His word. And could I just spot them $10,000 and they'd pay me back with interest by March? By last summer, I had given them somewhere in the neighborhood of $41,000, over the course about 18 months. I had never asked for a penny back. I had never brought it up at the dinner table. I had never made my daughter feel like a debtor. I am telling you this not to paint myself as a saint. I'm not, but to establish the context for what happened next. In September, they asked if they could move in. The request came from my daughter. She sat across from me at that same dining room table, the one I'd built in 1991, and she told me they were going to lose the house. The mortgage situation had escalated beyond what they could manage, and her husband's sales numbers had dropped, and they needed a place to stay while they got back on their feet. 6 months, she said. Maybe 8, just until things stabilized. I said yes. Of course I said yes. This is my daughter. This is my grandson. I converted my home office into a bedroom for my grandson and moved my desk down to the basement, and I told them to take the second bedroom and I'd stay in the master. They arrived on a Saturday in early October with a moving truck and 4 carloads of things, and it took most of the day to get it all inside. My son-in-law shook my hand at the end of it and said, "We really appreciate this, sir." I told him it was what family does. The first few weeks were fine. More than fine, honestly. Having my grandson under the same roof every morning was something I hadn't anticipated would affect me so much. He'd come padding into the kitchen in his pajamas while I was making coffee, and he'd climb up onto his stool. I bought him a step stool, the non-slip kind from Target, and he'd watch me crack eggs with complete seriousness, like he was studying for a test. I'd make him scrambled eggs with a little cheese the way his grandmother used to make mine when I was sick, and he'd eat every bite and ask for more. Those mornings alone were worth every complication that came after. The complications came gradually. At first it was small things. My son-in-law had opinions about the thermostat. He liked it warmer than I did, and he started adjusting it without asking, and I'd come downstairs to find it set at 76 when I'd had it at 68. I mentioned it once, politely. He laughed and said he ran cold. I let it go. He started taking my parking spot in the garage. This sounds minor, I know, but I have a bad hip, I've had 2 surgeries, and the extra distance from the street matters to me in cold weather and after rain. I mentioned it. He said he hadn't realized, and then continued parking there. He rearranged my kitchen. I came home from a dentist appointment one Tuesday to find that someone had reorganized my cabinets. The mugs were in a different place. The pots were in a different place. The drawer where I kept my tools, the small ones, the screwdriver and the pliers, and the measuring tape I use for everyday tasks, had been consolidated with the junk drawer, and I couldn't find my favorite spatula for 3 days. When I asked my daughter about it, she said her husband thought it made more sense this way, and she thought maybe he had a point. He began inviting people over without asking me. Friends of his, couples from his work, a group of guys he apparently watched football with somewhere. They started appearing on Sunday afternoons in my living room, with coolers and take-out containers, and the volume on my television set to a level I found genuinely painful. He didn't ask. He announced, "Hey, the guys are coming over Sunday, cool?" And then they came on Sunday regardless of my response. I said it wasn't ideal timing once, and he looked at me with something in his eyes that I recognized but couldn't immediately name, and then he said, "Well, I live here too now, right? I live here too now." That sentence sat in my chest for several days. By December, the dynamic had shifted in a way I'm not sure I can fully articulate. He had developed, somehow, the posture of a man in his own home. He sat at the head of the dining room table. My chair, the one I had sat in for 30 years, without comment or acknowledgement. He controlled the television remote. He spoke over me when I was mid-sentence and didn't notice or didn't care. He told my daughter what to cook. He made decisions about my home. My home, the one I'd painted and repaired and mortgaged and paid off and lived in for 32 years, and he made them as if his name was on the deed. And I stayed quiet. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to upset my daughter. I stayed quiet because my grandson was there, and I didn't want him to witness conflict. I stayed quiet because I am 67 years old, and I have spent a lifetime choosing my battles. And I was still, God help me, still trying to figure out which hill was worth dying on. And then came Thanksgiving. We'd agreed that Thanksgiving would be at the house. My daughter wanted to host, her words, her house now apparently, and she'd invited her husband's parents and his sister and her fiancé. I had no objection. I like cooking. I had been looking forward to making the recipes my wife and I used to make together. Her mother's cornbread dressing, the sweet potato casserole with the brown sugar crust, the green beans she did with bacon, and a little apple cider vinegar. I'd been thinking about it since October. I came downstairs at 7 in the morning on Thanksgiving Day to start the turkey. It needed to go in early. My son-in-law was already in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, drinking coffee he'd made in my coffee maker, reading something on his phone. I said good morning. He nodded without looking up. I started pulling things out of the refrigerator. He looked up then. Hey, so Carla's handling the food this year? I didn't understand what he meant. Carla is his sister. She's bringing everything. She does a big spread. It's kind of her thing. We told her she could take point on the meal. I stood there with my hand on a bag of fresh green beans. I said, I was planning to cook. He shrugged. We figured you'd want to relax and enjoy the day. You're always doing so much. I put the green beans back. I put the sweet potatoes back. I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of my bed and I looked at my hands for a long moment. Then I went back downstairs and I found something to do in the garage. Carla arrived at 2 in the afternoon with her fiancés and 4 aluminum trays from a restaurant catering service. The food was fine. It was perfectly adequate catering food. My grandson ate macaroni and cheese from a tray and seemed happy. His grandfather sat at the far end of the table, not the head, not anymore, and ate turkey that someone else had cooked and said very little and watched his son-in-law hold court at the other end of the room. Dinner was winding down. People were pushing back from the table. I was asking my grandson if he wanted more rolls when my son-in-law, mid-conversation with his father, held up his hand toward me. Not a wave, a gesture. The kind you make at a child who is interrupting adult conversation, he said without turning to look at me. Just a sec. He was telling me to wait. In my own house, I set down the breadbasket. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her plate. I looked at his parents. His father was nodding along to whatever story his son had been telling. His mother was on her phone. No one looked at me. No one said anything. And the room was quiet for just a moment before my son-in-law finished his story, and the table laughed and someone asked for more wine. I excused myself. I said I wasn't feeling well. My daughter started to stand and I told her I was fine, just tired. Go ahead and enjoy the rest of the evening. I went upstairs. I sat in my room. My grandson knocked on my door about 20 minutes later, just to check on me. The way a 4-year-old checks on someone. He pressed his forehead against my knee and said, "You sick, Pop?" And I told him I was just a little tired and he said okay, and then went back downstairs. And I sat in that room for a long time in the dark. I made a decision that night. The next morning I called my attorney. I've had the same attorney for 20 years, a family law and estate attorney in Scottsdale, who handled my wife's estate and did some contract work when I was consulting after I retired. I told him I needed a meeting, soon, and I needed to discuss a few things. He got me in that Friday. I also called a real estate agent I knew through a neighbor, a woman I'd met at a block party years ago who specialized in residential property in the East Valley. I told her I was thinking of selling my house. She asked me when. I said soon. I want to be honest about something. There was a part of me, a significant part of me, that was hoping I was overreacting, that I would sleep on it for a few days, look at the situation clearly, and find a reasonable path forward. A conversation, a set of boundaries, an adult discussion between family members that ended in mutual understanding and things going back to normal. I gave that path about 4 days. On the Monday after Thanksgiving, I came down for breakfast to find my son-in-law on a video call in my living room. He had his laptop open on my coffee table and he was speaking loudly to someone about quarterly projections. And he had not shut the door, and the call was echoing through the entire downstairs. I walked through to the kitchen. He didn't acknowledge me. I poured my coffee and went back to my room. At lunch, he was in the kitchen eating leftovers from the catering trays, still on his phone, and he'd left the aluminum containers open on the counter. I closed them. He didn't look up. I said, "I'd appreciate it if you wiped down the counter when you're done." He said, "Yep," and kept scrolling his phone. I went to my attorney's office that Friday. My attorney is practical and thorough, two qualities I value immensely in a professional relationship. He didn't editorialize when I explained the situation. He just listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and then laid out my options with the same calm he brings to everything. First, he said, "The house is mine. I own it outright. The deed is in my name alone. My wife's name was removed after her passing, and the estate was settled. My son-in-law and daughter are guests in the legal sense, regardless of what the informal arrangement looked like. The notice period required to ask them to leave, in Arizona, was 30 days, even for family members with no formal lease. Second, he said, he'd looked at what I'd described about the financial transfers and the informal agreements, and there was no legal obligation on their part to repay me. It was all gifts, undocumented. He didn't say this judgmentally. He just said it. Third, and this was the part I want you to understand, he advised me to review my estate planning. My wife and I had done our wills and beneficiary designations together years ago, and things had not been formally updated since her passing. He strongly recommended I do so before taking any further action. He said this quietly, but he said it directly, and I heard him. I also met with the real estate agent. She walked through the house on a Saturday morning, made notes, measured rooms, took photographs. She told me that based on current market conditions in Chandler, she expected the property to list between $580,000 and $610,000. I had purchased it for $114,000 in 1991. I sat with that number for a moment. She said demand in that area was strong, and if I priced it right, she expected we'd have offers within 2 weeks. I told her I wanted to list it in January. I didn't tell my daughter or her husband, not yet. I spent December preparing. I revised my estate documents with my attorney, a process I should have completed years ago regardless of any of this. I transferred certain accounts, updated beneficiary designations, made the arrangements that a 67-year-old man with a paid-off house and a decent retirement portfolio should have made years ago. I also began quietly moving my personal belongings. Not dramatically. I didn't want to tip my hand, but things that were important to me. My wife's jewelry, which I keep in a lockbox, her photographs, certain documents, small things from my home office that had meaning. A coffee mug my grandson had painted for me at one of those ceramic painting places. The measuring tape my father gave me when I was 22, the one I've used on every home repair project I've touched since then. I brought these things to a storage unit I rented on the east side of town, and I made the trips early on Saturday mornings when no one was watching. Christmas arrived. My daughter had again made plans without my input. Her husband's family was coming again, same group as Thanksgiving, plus a few additions. She'd ordered a catered meal from a different restaurant this time, something I learned about when a confirmation email accidentally came through to my email address because she'd used mine for the order form. She sent me an apologetic text saying she thought I'd prefer not to worry about cooking this year. I replied that it was fine. The house filled up on Christmas afternoon. There were children I hadn't met before, cousins of my son-in-law's from somewhere out of state. People I didn't know were in my home, using my bathroom, sitting in my chairs. My son-in-law moved through it all like a host. He greeted people at the door. He directed people to the kitchen. He poured drinks. He told a group of men to make themselves comfortable in the den and turned the television to a football game at a volume that made conversation anywhere else in the house difficult. I sat in the living room with my grandson for a while. We looked at a book about trucks. He showed me all the ones he knew the names of and corrected me when I got them wrong. It was genuinely the best part of the day. Dinner was served at 5. I took my usual seat, not the head, I'd given that up by then, and I waited while the catering trays were set out and people found their places. My grandson sat next to me and immediately asked for rolls, which I appreciated. The room was loud. His family is a loud family, expressive, the kind that talks over each other and laughs at volume, and someone is always telling a story at the same time as someone else. My son-in-law was at the head of the table. He stood briefly to thank his sister for the food, which she hadn't brought this time, but I suppose the gesture was habitual. He made a toast. He called the house our home, not once but twice. I watched my daughter smile when he said it. I had just started on my plate when my son-in-law's mother leaned across the table and began asking me something about the neighborhood. Whether I thought it was a good area for young families, whether property values were going up, the kind of conversation people make when they're being polite. I was telling her that yes, the school district was excellent when my son-in-law interrupted. Not rudely, exactly. It wasn't that kind of interruption. He redirected. He pulled his mother's attention back to something his father was saying, a story about a trip they were planning. He did it smoothly. The conversation turned. His mother smiled at me briefly and turned away. I went back to my plate. About 40 minutes later, as dinner was ending and people were starting to talk about dessert, I stood up to start clearing plates. I do this out of habit. I have been the person who clears the table at every meal in this house for 30 years. My son-in-law looked up from whatever story he was telling and he said, loud enough that the table could hear, "Hey, you don't need to do that. Sit down, let the women handle the cleanup." I stopped. The table didn't exactly go quiet. There was still conversation happening at the other end. But the people near us had heard him. His mother had heard him. My daughter had heard him. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her dessert fork, which she was turning over in her hands. I set the plates down. I looked at my son-in-law. I said, very calmly, "This is my house. I'll clear the plates in my own house." He smiled. It was a patient smile, the smile of a man explaining something obvious to someone who is being difficult. He said, "Come on, relax. You're a guest here tonight." A guest. In my own house. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be very clear about that. I didn't slam anything. I didn't make a speech. I looked at him for a moment and I said, "All right." I picked the plates back up. I carried them to the kitchen. I set them in the sink. I took my jacket from the hook by the side door. I told my daughter, who had followed me to the kitchen with a look on her face I recognized, worried, guilty, already starting to defend him in her mind. I told her that I was going to step out for a bit and I would be back later. She said, "Dad?" And I said, "Not tonight. We'll talk tomorrow." I drove to a hotel. The Marriott on Dobson, 15 minutes away. I got a room for 2 nights because I wasn't entirely sure of my timeline. I ordered room service and I watched the evening news and I slept better than I had in months. The next morning I called my attorney. The following Tuesday, the listing went up. My daughter called me the morning the listing went live. She had seen it, I assume, the way people see things now. Someone probably sent it to her, or she was searching the address, or it simply appeared in front of her through whatever digital mechanism surfaces these things. She was not calm. She asked me if this was real. I told her it was. She asked when I had decided this. I said a while ago. She started to cry. I told her I loved her and that I was not angry with her and that we would talk about all of it, but not on the phone. Her husband called me 20 minutes later. He was not calm either, but in a different way. He was the particular kind of not calm that sounds like calm, measured, controlled, but with something underneath it that wanted out. He said this was an extreme reaction to nothing. He said I was being irrational. He said I had made a unilateral decision that affected his family without consulting anyone. I listened to all of it. When he was done, I said, "Yes, it's my house. That's what unilateral means." And I ended the call. They had 30 days to vacate, which is what Arizona law required. My attorney sent the formal notice. I was not cruel about it. I did not require them to leave in a week. I did not change the locks in the night. I did not go to war over every detail. I gave them the full 30 days, and I made it clear they were welcome to stay through the end of it. And I came back to the house after a few days, and I was polite and present, and I made breakfast, and I read books, and I took my grandson to the park twice a week until they found a place. They found an apartment in Mesa. Smaller than what they wanted, I imagine, but sufficient. They moved out in late January. I put the house on the market properly in the first week of February. We received 3 offers in the first 10 days. I accepted one at $595,000. The closing was in March. I bought a smaller place. A 2-bedroom condo in Scottsdale, new construction. On a golf course I don't golf on, but enjoy looking at. It's quieter than I expected myself to want. But it's mine in a way that my house, by the end, had stopped feeling like mine. I have a coffee maker that I use every morning, and a kitchen that I have not once had to reorganize. The thermostat is set at 68, and it stays at 68. My daughter and I have dinner together about twice a month. It took a few months for her to get there. There was a period of silence, then anger, then something that looked like grief, and then, slowly, something that looked like honesty. She told me she knew things had gotten out of hand. She didn't say he was wrong. She didn't say I was right. She said she was sorry that it got to where it did, and I told her I was too, and I meant it. That dinner lasted 3 hours. We talked about her mother. We talked about my grandson. We talked about things we hadn't talked about in years. I drove home afterward and sat in my kitchen with a glass of water and thought, well, there it is. My grandson still calls me Pop. He comes to my condo now on Saturday afternoons, and we look at truck books, and I make him scrambled eggs with a little cheese, and he climbs onto a new step stool I bought from Target, the same kind as before, non-slip, and he watches me cook with the same seriousness he's always had, like he's studying for something important. I still have my father's measuring tape. I keep it in the kitchen drawer, right where I can find it. Some things, I have learned, are worth being very precise about.